On the night before D-Day, 6 men jumped into occupied France with 200 lifeless companions made of burlap and straw, and convinced the German army that an entire airborne division had landed behind their lines. What happened next would cost some of them everything, deceive thousands of enemy soldiers, and vanish almost entirely from history. This is the story of the men who fell with the Dummies, stayed in the shadows, and changed the course of the invasion. The briefing room at RAF Tempsford smelled of tobacco, sweat, and the particular tension that comes when men are told they will not be coming back soon. Lieutenant Frederick Fowls stood at the front of the cramped Nissen hut, studying the faces of his 5 SAS commandos, Jenkins, Davies, Hewitt, and 2 others whose names would soon be written in classified files and forgotten by all but their families. Behind him, a large-scale map of Normandy showed a triangle of drop zones northeast of the Cotentin Peninsula, well inland from the beaches codenamed Utah and Omaha. The zones were marked Titanic 1, 2, and 3. Fowls was assigned Titanic 4, a patch of moonlit farmland near the village of Sabotage. On the concrete floor beside him sat the Roberts. That was the operational nickname for them, Roberts, or sometimes Ruperts in other units. 200 paradummies constructed of Hessian sacking stuffed with sand and straw, each fitted with a rudimentary parachute and a self-destruct mechanism. A length of slow-burning fuse tied to a bundle of gun cotton designed to incinerate the dummy and its rigging 90 minutes after landing. The dummies were crude but ingenious. Each wore a basic painted helmet and uniform outline. Attached to some were pintail simulators, small pyrotechnic devices that popped and cracked on landing, mimicking rifle fire. Others carried recordings. Miniature gramophones packed in waterproof cases, wound-tight and ready to play a looped cacophony of boots on gravel, shouted orders in English, the clatter of equipment, even the unmistakable bark of American M1 Garans. The gramophone tapes had been recorded by BBC sound engineers at enormous cost and secrecy. When played in the open countryside of Normandy, they were expected to sound like a battalion or more of paratroopers consolidating after a drop. Fowls had inspected each dummy personally that afternoon, checking parachute ties and fuse lengths, his hands smelling of cordite and canvas. The pintails were delicate. Moisture could ruin them. The gramophones were heavier than expected, perhaps 3 kilograms each, and there were 12 of them. He and his stick would carry those in on their own parachutes, along with their weapons, Sten guns, a Bren Mills grenades, rations for 3 days, a TR 1936 radio set, and a few satchel charges for sabotage work. The plan was simple in outline and terrifying in detail. They would drop with the Roberts at 0030 hours on the 6th of June, deploy the gramophones and pintails across a wide area to simulate a large-scale airborne landing, and then, here the briefing officer had paused, choosing his words carefully, remain in the field to observe enemy reaction, conduct sabotage, and report intelligence until extraction or link up with advancing Allied forces. No one in the room believed extraction was likely. The Allies would be fighting for every meter of beach. The notion that they would divert resources to pull out 6 men from deep behind enemy lines was, at best, optimistic. Davies, the youngest of the stick, had asked how long they should expect to wait. The briefing officer, a major whose name Fowls never learned, said it depended on the speed of the breakout. A week, perhaps, maybe 10 days. Fowls had looked at the ration packs on the table and done the arithmetic in his head. 3 days of food. A week of survival. After that, they would be foraging, stealing, improvising. Davies nodded and said nothing more. The flight out was scheduled for late evening on the 5th. At 2,100 hours, Fowls and his men boarded a short Sterling bomber on the Tempsford runway, the Roberts already loaded in cargo containers slung beneath the aircraft's belly. The Sterling was an ugly, reliable workhorse, its 4 engines thrumming with a low, steady roar that vibrated through the fuselage. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold. The men sat on fold-down benches, gripping their static lines, their faces lit intermittently by the glow of the navigator's instruments forward. Jenkins sat across from Fowls, his Sten cradled across his knees, his expression unreadable. Hewitt was next to him, chewing gum in slow, rhythmic pulses. Davies stared at the floor, his hands clasped between his knees. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. The channel crossing took 40 minutes. The aircraft flew low, beneath radar, the engines throttled back to reduce noise. Through the small round windows, Fowls could see the moonlight on the water, a silver pathway stretching toward France. Above, scattered clouds drifted across the face of the moon. It was a bomber's moon, the kind of night when shadows were long and clear and a man could see his own parachute canopy against the sky. The dispatcher, a flight sergeant with a clipped Yorkshire accent, moved down the cabin checking static lines and harnesses. He tapped Fowls on the shoulder and pointed to the red light above the jump door. 5 minutes. The Sterling crossed the French coast at 0020 hours. Below, the countryside was dark. No lights, no movement, just the geometric patchwork of hedgerows and fields that was the bocage. Fowls could make out individual trees in the moonlight, the thin line of a road. The dispatcher slid open the jump door and the cabin filled with the roar of wind and engines. The air smelled of aviation fuel and the sea. The red light stayed on. Fowls stood, clipped his static line to the overhead cable, and shuffled toward the door. The others formed up behind him. The dispatcher held up one hand, fingers spread. For minutes. 3. The aircraft banked slightly, correcting course. Fowls could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, the familiar pre-jump cocktail of adrenaline and dread. Then the light turned green. He went out headfirst into the slipstream, the wind tearing at his face and limbs, the static line snapping taut behind him. The parachute deployed with a sharp jerk that drove the harness straps into his shoulders and groin. For a moment he hung suspended in the moonlight, the Sterling's engines fading above him, and then he looked down. The ground was closer than he expected, perhaps 200 meters, and rising fast. Around him, the sky was filled with parachutes. The Roberts were falling in a wide scatter, their canopies fluttering like pale moths. He could see Jenkins and Hewitt below and to his left, Davies further out. The pintails began to pop, sharp, irregular cracks that echoed across the fields, and then one of the gramophones hit the ground and started playing. Even from the air, Fowls could hear it. The unmistakable tramp of marching boots, the shout of a sergeant, the metallic clatter of equipment. It was surreal and brilliant and profoundly unsettling. He hit the ground hard in a plowed field, rolled, and came up tangled in his rigging. The parachute dragged him a few meters before he could release the harness. He lay still for a moment, listening. The gramophone was still playing, perhaps 100 meters to the south. More pintails cracked and fizzed in the darkness. A Roberts landed 10 meters away with a soft thump. Fowls crawled over to it, checked the fuse burning steadily, and moved on. Jenkins appeared out of the shadows, breathing hard, his sten at the ready. Then Hewitt and one of the others. They crouched in the lee of a hedgerow, counting heads. Davies arrived last, limping slightly. All 6 accounted for. No injuries beyond bruises. Fowls glanced at his watch. 0032 hours. They had 90 minutes before the Roberts began to burn. The gramophones would run for about 20 minutes each, depending on how tightly they had been wound. Already, Fowls could hear distant shouts in German, the sound of vehicles starting. A flare shot up to the east, a brilliant white star that hung in the sky for 30 seconds before drifting down on its parachute. In the harsh magnesium light, Fowls could see the scattered shapes of the Roberts across the field, at least 50 of them in his immediate view. More flares followed. The Germans were reacting. The stick moved quickly, deploying the remaining gramophones in a wide arc across the drop zone. Fowls placed one himself, winding the spring mechanism, setting the needle on the record, and stepping back as the sound rolled out across the hedgerows. Boots on gravel, the bark of orders, the unmistakable cadence of an American infantry company on the move. It was deeply strange to hear those recorded voices in the silent French night, knowing they were ghosts, echoes, lies designed to pull German infantry away from the beaches. But it was working. Fowls could hear vehicles now, several of them, engines racing, voices shouting coordinates. A burst of machine gun fire, poorly aimed, stitching a line of tracers across the sky half a kilometer away. By 0130 hours, the paradummies were burning. Fowls watched from the cover of a dense thicket as the first Roberts ignited. A sudden flare of orange flame that consumed the Hessian and rigging in seconds and left only a blackened patch on the ground. One by one, across the drop zone, the other dummies followed, each a brief flare in the darkness. The self-destruct mechanism was crude but effective. Within minutes, the evidence was gone. All that remained were scorched circles in the fields and the memory of sound. The gramophones had stopped. The pintails were silent. But the German reaction continued. Fowls counted at least 12 vehicles, possibly more, moving along the roads to the north and east. Searchlights swept the hedgerows. Patrols fanned out on foot, calling to each other, firing at shadows. It was then that Fowls made the decision that would define the next 6 weeks of his life. The original plan called for immediate evasion after deployment, a withdrawal to a prearranged hide and a passive wait for Allied forces. But the German response was larger and more sustained than intelligence had predicted. If the stick withdrew now, the deception would collapse within hours. The Germans would find no paratroopers, no equipment, no evidence of a landing beyond burn marks in the fields. They would realize it was a feint and redeploy their forces to the coast. But if the stick stayed active, cut telephone lines, blew a rail junction, left traces of a small commando force operating behind the lines, the illusion could be sustained. The Germans would continue to search. They would keep troops inland. They would hesitate. Fowls gathered the stick in the thicket and explained his reasoning in a whisper. Jenkins nodded immediately. Hewitt looked uncertain but said nothing. Davies asked how long. Fowls said a few days, maybe a week, until the front moved close enough for them to slip through. They would live off the land, avoid contact, and strike only when the sabotage served the larger deception. The vote was unanimous. The first target was a telephone line running parallel to the main road, a thick cable strung between wooden poles. Fowls and Jenkins cut it with wire cutters just before dawn, a clean, silent severing that would force the local German command to rely on radio or runners. The second target was a small electrical transformer on the outskirts of a village, a squat metal box that supplied power to a rail signal system. Hewitt placed a satchel charge with a time pencil fuse, and they withdrew to a safe distance. The explosion, when it came, was sharp and brief, a flash of blue-white light followed by the hum of severed cables sparking against wet ground. By the time German soldiers arrived to investigate, the stick was 2 kilometers away, moving through the hedgerows in single file, silent as shadows. For the first week, the routine was almost bearable. They moved by night, slept in dense cover during the day, and rationed their food carefully. The TR-1936 radio worked intermittently. Hewitt, the designated signalman, managed to get a brief transmission out on the third night, reporting their position and the scale of the German reaction. But the set was temperamental and the batteries were failing. By the 8th day, the radio was dead. They buried it in a shallow grave beneath a hedgerow and continued without it. The German response, meanwhile, showed no sign of diminishing. Patrols were constant. The stick observed troops from the 352nd Infantry Division moving inland, away from the coast, searching the bocage for the phantom paratroopers. Fowls estimated that at least 2 battalions, perhaps 3, were tied down in the search. Thousands of men who might otherwise have been deployed to reinforce the beach defenses or counterattack the landing zones. It was impossible to know how much of this was due to Titanic and how much to other factors, but the correlation was unmistakable. The deception was holding, but the cost was accumulating. By the end of the second week, the rations were gone. The stick began foraging, stealing eggs from henhouses, digging up root vegetables from gardens, once slaughtering a stray goat in the middle of the night and butchering it in silence. They grew thinner. Hewitt developed a persistent cough. Davies, who had twisted his ankle on the landing, found the injury worsening. By the third week, he could barely walk without pain. They fashioned a crude splint from a broken branch and parachute cord, but it was clear he needed medical attention they could not provide. The sabotage continued, a rail line blown with the last of their explosives. A fuel depot set alight with a Molotov cocktail improvised from a wine bottle and petrol siphoned from a parked Wehrmacht truck. Each action was carefully calibrated to maintain the illusion of a small, professional force rather than a desperate, starving stick at the end of its endurance. Fowls was acutely aware that they were now operating well beyond their original mission parameters. The D-Day landings had succeeded. They had heard the distant rumble of naval gunfire on the morning of the 6th, had seen Allied aircraft overhead in enormous formations, but the breakout was slow. The bocage was a defender's paradise, every hedgerow a fortress, every field a potential killing ground. The American advance from Utah Beach was grinding forward at a painful crawl. The stick was still more than 30 kilometers behind German lines. By the beginning of the fourth week, Davies could no longer keep up. His ankle was infected, the flesh around the splint swollen and discolored. He was running a fever. Fowls made the decision to leave him in a barn with a canteen of water and the last of their medical supplies, a few sulfa tablets and a roll of bandage, while the rest of the stick moved toward the American lines. It was not abandonment. It was triage. Davies understood. He shook Fowls's hand and told him to finish the job. They never saw him again. Later, after the war, Fowls would learn that Davies had been found by a German patrol the following day, delirious with fever, and taken to a field hospital where he died of septicemia 3 days later. His grave was marked with a simple wooden cross and eventually relocated to a Commonwealth War cemetery. But on that night in late June, Fowls knew only that he was leaving a man behind, and the weight of that decision sat in his chest like a stone. The American lines were tantalizingly close. The stick could hear the artillery now, a steady, rolling thunder from the west. At night, the horizon flickered with muzzle flashes. They moved carefully, avoiding roads and villages, navigating by compass and the North Star. The German presence was thinner here, the defenses oriented westward. On the night of July 10th, Fowls estimated they were less than 2 kilometers from the forward American positions. They could smell diesel and cordite on the wind. They could hear the crackle of radio transmissions, the shout of orders in English. They were almost home. They spent the day in a shallow ditch overgrown with brambles, perhaps 180 meters from the American lines. Fowls could see the edge of a farmhouse being used as a forward command post, the antenna of a radio set visible against the sky. They would cross after dark, he decided. A slow, careful approach, hands visible, calling out identification codes. It would be risky. Friendly fire was a constant hazard in the bocage, but less risky than remaining behind German lines indefinitely. Then, in the late afternoon, Jenkins found the parachute silk. It was tangled in the brambles at the edge of the ditch, a long streamer of white nylon half buried in the mud. One of the Roberts, perhaps, its canopy torn free during the drop and carried by the wind. Or one of their own chutes, lost in the chaos of that first night. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it was visible from the American position, a clear marker of their location. Fowls considered moving, but the ditch was the best cover for a kilometer in any direction. They stayed. The mortar barrage began at dusk. The first round landed 20 meters short, a sharp crack followed by a spray of dirt and shrapnel. Fowls shouted for the stick to stay down, but the American gunners had the range now. The second round landed at the lip of the ditch. The third hit directly in the center of their position. Fowls felt the concussion as a wall of pressure that lifted him and slammed him back down. His ears ringing, his vision blurred. He tasted blood and dirt. Somewhere, someone was screaming. He crawled toward the sound and found Hewitt, his leg shredded below the knee, the bone visible through torn flesh. Jenkins was unconscious, a gash across his forehead. The fourth round landed further away, and then the barrage stopped. Fowls shouted in English, his voice hoarse and desperate. "Cease fire! British troops! Cease fire!" For a long moment, there was silence. Then American voices calling back, uncertain. "Identify yourselves!" Fowls shouted their unit designation, the code word from the briefing, anything he could remember. Slowly, figures emerged from the farmhouse, rifles raised. They advanced cautiously across the field, a squad of American infantry, their helmets silhouetted against the evening sky. The Americans were young, nervous, trigger fingers tight. They saw the parachute silk first, then the stick emerging from the ditch, filthy, emaciated, armed, speaking English but dressed in mud-caked British battle dress that might as easily be German camouflage in the failing light. The squad sergeant barked an order and the stick was surrounded, rifles leveled at their chests. Fowls raised his hands slowly, carefully. "We're SAS," he said. "British SAS. We dropped on D-Day. We're on your side." The sergeant looked at him for a long moment, then spat into the dirt. "Face down," he said. "Hands on your heads. Now." They were taken as prisoners. It took 6 hours to confirm their identity. They were marched to a rear area intelligence post, stripped, searched, and interrogated by a captain who spoke fluent German and passable English and seemed convinced they were enemy infiltrators. Fowls repeated their story calmly, methodically, giving the details of Operation Titanic, the drop zones, the Roberts, the gramophone recordings. The captain took notes and said nothing. Eventually, a British liaison officer arrived, a major from 2nd Army Intelligence, who recognized the code words and confirmed the existence of Titanic. The Americans released them with apologies that felt perfunctory and hollow. Hewitt was evacuated to a field hospital, where surgeons saved his leg but left him with a permanent limp. Jenkins recovered from his concussion but never fully shook the headaches. Fowls spent 3 days in a rest camp, eating hot food and sleeping on a cot, before being debriefed by an officer from SAS headquarters. He filed a written report detailing the operation, the sabotage, Davies' fate, and his assessment of the deception's impact. The officer read the report, nodded, and told him it would be classified. Fowls asked what would happen to the Roberts, whether the operation would be made public. The officer smiled thinly. "That's above my pay grade, Lieutenant. But between you and me, I doubt it. Too many questions. Too many dead ends. Better to let it fade." Fowls was awarded the Military Cross in a quiet ceremony 6 months later. The citation mentioned gallantry and resourceful leadership during special operations in Normandy, but gave no details. Jenkins and Hewitt received commendations. Davies received a posthumous mention in dispatches. None of the citations mentioned the Roberts or Titanic. The operation remained classified for decades. The Germans, meanwhile, had been deceived exactly as intended. Post-war interrogations revealed that units of the 352nd and 91st Infantry Divisions had spent the crucial hours of D-Day searching the inland areas northeast of the beaches, convinced that a large Allied airborne force had landed behind their lines. The sound recordings and pintails had been remarkably effective. Several German after-action reports described hearing at least a battalion, possibly more, and observing coordinated small arms fire consistent with an airborne landing. The subsequent sabotage, the cut telephone lines, the blown transformer, the rail explosion, had reinforced the illusion and kept the search parties active for weeks. Captured German intelligence documents, presented at the Nuremberg war crimes trials as evidence of the Allies' meticulous deception planning, included references to phantom paratroopers in the Cotentin and unidentified enemy commandos operating with unusual boldness. The documents were filed away and forgotten by all but a few historians. Fowls returned to civilian life in 1946, married, worked as an engineer, and rarely spoke of the war. When pressed, he would say only that he had served in France and leave it at that. He died in 1992, his obituary noting his military cross but making no mention of Titanic or the Roberts. Jenkins emigrated to Canada. Hewitt became a schoolteacher in Wales. None of them attended the 50th anniversary commemorations of D-Day. The operation they had risked everything for remained a footnote, known only to specialists and archivists. A few of the Roberts survived. One was recovered from a barn in Normandy in the 1950s, its Hessian charred but intact, the self-destruct fuse unburned. It was donated to the Airborne Assault Museum in Duxford, where it sits today in a glass case, a strange and fragile relic. Visitors often walk past it without a second glance. It looks like what it is: a crude dummy, a scarecrow dressed in military colors. But for a few hours on the night of June 5, 1944, that dummy and its companions convinced the German army that an entire airborne division had fallen from the sky. They bought time, minutes, hours, perhaps days, while men like Fowls and Davies and Jenkins stayed behind enemy lines, starving and hunted, to keep the lie alive. Historians estimate that Titanic diverted between 2,000 and 5,000 German soldiers from the beach defenses during the critical opening phase of the invasion. That diversion, small in the grand calculus of D-Day, may have saved hundreds of Allied lives. The men who fell with the Roberts paid for that diversion with blood, hunger, and years of silence. The final irony is this: the operation worked so well that almost no one knew it had happened. The Roberts burned, the Gramophones fell silent, the Pintails went dark. The men who stayed behind were captured or killed or repatriated in silence. The official histories of D-Day give Titanic a sentence, sometimes two, and move on to larger battles and more famous names. But on certain nights, when the moon is full and the wind moves through the hedgerows of Normandy, you can almost hear them. The Phantom Army, the Burlap soldiers, the 6 men who fell with 200 ghosts and held the line until the lie became truth. If this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel to hear more hidden histories like this one. Hit the like button to help others discover the untold sacrifices of operations like Titanic. And leave a comment below. Do you think the Roberts were a brilliant stroke of military deception? Or was it an unforgivable risk to send 6 men into the night with nothing but dummies and lies? Let me know what you think.